Hello, my name is Rayyane Tabet, and I'll be reading excerpts from Aṣfūriyyeh, A History of Madness, Modernity, and War in the Middle East, a book by Joelle Abi-Rached. Growing up in Beirut, I was always told of a place on a hill called Aṣfūriyyeh, which exists in the imaginary of people from my parents' generation and my own as a mental hospital. That place exists also in people's imaginary because of it. I mean, it's famous for its name that closely resembles the word used for birds in Arabic, which is Aṣfūr. And so years later, when I started studying architecture at the American University of Beirut, during my first year there, we actually visited the site of this mental hospital, who by that time had become a modern ruin. And the visit was a site visit for a potential research project there. Soon after, I actually left Beirut and moved to the United States to finish my studies there. But that visit to this kind of modern medical ruin, alongside these memories of an imagined place from my childhood, stayed with me. And years later, actually many years later in 2020, during the pandemic, I came across this book, which had just been released, about the history of this hospital. And I was very kind of drawn to it because for many years I had tried to find information about Aṣfūriyyeh, and very little had ever been published about it. And so, I would say in also more recent times, with everything that's going on both personally and sociopolitically around us, it's a book that I would say offers me a state of refuge to think about the rise and fall of a mental institution that charts also the rise and the fall of a country. So basically, Aṣfūriyyeh, formerly the Lebanon Hospital for the Insane, was founded by a Swiss Quaker missionary in the late 19th century as a result of the civil war that had happened in 1860 in Lebanon, which kind of gave rise to the involvement of missionary work in Lebanon particularly, but in the region at large. And the hospital lasted for about 100 years and was shut down in 1982 following the decline of its own management, but also the sectarian politics of the Lebanese civil war that rendered its existence impossible as the only secular medical institution that catered for the clinically insane. And for me, that kind of entanglement between modernity, history, the project of kind of technological development that has to come to terms with the shortcomings of certain societal, economic, and historical kind of stressors is not just a metaphor, but it's a way through which to think about our present condition. So I'm gonna be reading a few sentences, particularly from the preface, and then a few quotes from the epilogue. So just kind of to bookend how this book kind of charts this rise and fall. And hopefully some of it will make sense. According to the French alienist Alexandre Brière de Moismont, history can be written through the kinds of mental disorders that manifest themselves in a particular society. This could not be any truer than in the case of the modern Middle East and particularly Lebanon. The history of madness is inescapably connected to the history of continuous socio-political upheavals, immigration, exile, socio-economic struggles, war, and violence that traumatized generations of Lebanese, including me. For my family and friends, it seemed that we lived in a huge madhouse where everyone had lost their mind. Politics was an irrational discourse, and the loss of reason or sheer madness was deplored and seen as the source of the many ills that had plagued the country and the entire Middle East. It's interesting to look through my this book because I also have a tendency to heavily highlight and write on the pages, so it's kind of it's like a double reading. Specifically, this book examines state-building processes and questions related to the impact of war on health and health infrastructures, an aspect that's generally either missing or treated only perfunctorily in the institutional histories of psychiatry. More generally, the book uses the biography of a single institution to examine historical processes of continuity and discontinuity and of stability and instability, and to question the politics and ethics of memory. In terms of psychopathologies, war and civil unrest brought to the force new symptoms, illnesses, and mental disorders from mental generations caused by emigration at the beginning of the 20th century to toxicomania during the Civil War. This book ends in 1982 with the closure of Aṣfūriyyeh. 2 years earlier, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, the diagnosis par excellence of trauma, was introduced in DSM number 3 after much lobbying by Vietnam War veterans. Thus, this new traumatic discourse is almost absent in the period the book covers. Though, as mentioned in chapter 4, psychiatrists used earlier iterations of PTSD like shell shock or war neurosis to make sense of the new psychological and behavioral complaints that combatants as well as veterans manifested, especially on the battlefield. In contrast, publications that examined PTSD per se hold from the 1990s onwards, and in the context of the Lebanese Civil War, focused mainly on civilian patient population. This is why the conceptual shift that PTSD enabled must be rethought as the product of new kinds of wars where civilians, rather than combatants, become frequent and often deliberate targets rather than mere bystanders. I've actually been thinking a lot about this sentence of late, particularly I was having conversation with some friends about this idea of a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is something very common in mental health conversations around mental health, particularly in Lebanon, but I would extend it more regionally and globally. And the conversation really revolves about the terminology itself, like post-traumatic, which assumes a position post the trauma. And I would argue that of late, but not particularly, since we're still inhabiting the trauma itself, it's quite complicated to think of a state post the trauma. And so we need to maybe rethink our imagination or even our understanding of how we apply these terminologies to our contexts, because I would think we're more in trauma stress disorder, and to kind of imagine ways of dealing with the trauma as it happens, which is probably why I keep going back to this book. More relevantly, Aṣfūriyyeh was one of the very few functional institutions where people from different sectarian groups could live and work together during the height of the civil war in the 1970s. The hospital remained faithful to its non-sectarian credo until its official closure in 1982, despite tremendous pressures during the civil war to forego this distinctive feature. Arguably, it was the hospital's pluralistic character that made it the target of violence during the Civil War. It's important to note this because after the Civil War, and basically today, the field of mental health, particularly in Lebanon, has been brought back to a sectarian condition. So currently, the two main institutions that deal with mental disorder in Lebanon are Dar al-Ajaz al-Islamiyya and Dar al-Salib, which are both institutions connected with specific religious groups. Not to say that they only cater for people who are from these religions, but then the logic right behind these institutions and their kind of making is sectarian in nature, which is telling of the times in which we are. This is why, in the end, the Aṣfūriyyeh cannot be viewed solely as a product of missionary work. Instead, it must be viewed as a hybrid institution that was the product of global as well as local efforts, interests, choices, actions, and encounters. It was the product of all these collective flows of agencies. Aṣfūriyyeh may also be viewed as a microcosm of the wider geopolitical region. The diverse political, economic, and demographic pressures are reflected in some of the manifestations of the various mental ailments and their causes. The history of madness is situated in time and place, and Aṣfūriyyeh is no exception. Now I'm going to jump to the end of the book and read some from the epilogue. The history of Aṣfūriyyeh reflects in many ways the history of modern Lebanon with its entanglements of macro and micro politics. One aspect that stands out in the long history of Aṣfūriyyeh is the violence that was inflicted on its patients, staff, and infrastructure during the Civil War. Alas, such violence against medical personnel and patients is not specific to the story of Aṣfūriyyeh. It is a natural consequence of the changing nature of armed conflict, the development of modern warfare, and the aerial bombardment of urban areas, which has become not only inevitable, but often strategic for punishment and deterrent for purposes. The Geneva Conventions and Protocols form the core of international humanitarian law, which regulates the conduct of armed conflicts and seeks to limit its effects. The original Geneva Convention of 1864 included provisions for military but not civilian hospitals, while the 1907 Hague Conventions contained some provisions on the protection of civilian hospitals. Strikingly, it is only in the Fourth Geneva Convention, signed in 1949, that they were first mentioned explicitly. Since the Second World War, the struggles for decolonization, and especially the surge in civil wars in the 1960s and 70s, transgressions against the neutrality and sanctity of shelters for the sick and wounded have continued to occur, which resulted in the signing in 1977 of 2 additional protocols that are specifically concerned with the treatments of the victims of war. However, what is flagrant and perhaps distinctive in our era is the ways in which hospitals have been used as tools of wars. Most recently, Médecins Sans Frontières, the international medical community, the WHO, and other non-governmental and humanitarian organizations, as well as numerous journalists and independent witnesses, have emphasized the radical shift toward deliberately and repeatedly targeting hospitals and the scale of such targeting to demoralize and terrorize civilians in contemporary armed conflict. Not only are hospitals' facilities no longer neutral zones as defined by the Geneva Conventions, but they have also become weaponized for strategic military purposes, and perhaps, more pertinently, their ruins are used as a warning against committing any act of resistance to or defiance of the status quo. Indeed, the repetitive targeting of physicians, medical convoys, and above all, hospitals, as in Syria, Yemen, Gaza, and Afghanistan, make us think about how and when we moved from a time when the rules of conducting wars were respected to some extent to an era in which they are entirely dismissed. The story of Aṣfūriyyeh invites us to think about the latest transformations of modern hospitals, from sacred spaces to tools and targets of war, as well as from spaces of hope and cure to places of death, misery, oblivion, and ruin. As a microcosm of Lebanon, Aṣfūriyyeh is a victim of both modernity, including modern warfare, and a mercantile mentality. It is this heavy sense of ruin and desolation, of lost opportunity and crumbling institutions, and of bereavement that weighs on Aṣfūriyyeh today. But there is more to this sense of loss and mourning. More significantly, the ruins are also a reflection of a failed project of modernity. The remains of Aṣfūriyyeh exemplify national as well as socio-political failure. Its downfall is part of a story of decline, inefficiency, and the breakdown of both society and the state that have failed to meaningfully support a generation's dream of renewed modernity. However, modernity is not only about technology, faith in the possibility of progress, and the rupture with tradition. It is also, and perhaps more so, about the reflexive appropriation of knowledge, and more specifically, about the ability for reflexivity and self-analysis. I really think a lot about this quote, that the inability to allow for people space for self-reflection is potentially some of the most troubling conditions of our present time. Medical ruins are arguably part of a broader set of modern ruins, or ruins of modernity, that include post-industrial wastelands, cities with their abandoned shops and businesses, deserted facilities, and crumbling infrastructures. But what should we take of hybrid institutions like Aṣfūriyyeh that cut through different temporalities and do not fit into one typology of modern medical ruin? Although Aṣfūriyyeh was a casualty of war and was used as a tool of war, it was also a casualty of poor management and of changing moral economy from missionary work to petrodollar. And then the question is, why should we preserve Aṣfūriyyeh? Why would people want to preserve the old buildings of Aṣfūriyyeh? What kinds of museum, memorial, or living archive do they want these buildings to turn into? And for what purpose? And here for me, it's the best quote in the book. As the anthropologist William Cunningham Bissell has suggested, the past provides precisely an imaginative resource for people struggling with the present, hoping to secure what can no longer be found in the future. When I first read that quote, I had to put like 3 exclamation marks next to it, because it's like the best definition of what I tried to do in my work for the last 20 years. Aṣfūriyyeh has become a memory space in the popular imagination. Like Beirut's Martyr Square or other public memorials and monuments, which undergo continuous metamorphoses alongside the radically changing sociopolitical landscape, Aṣfūriyyeh can be said to have become a monument with a life of its own. While the name Aṣfūriyyeh initially denoted the area where the hospital was situated, over the years it became synonymous with the hospital itself. Then Aṣfūriyyeh became a stigmatized term, a byword for severe mental illness, madness, deviance, and even mere eccentricity. The metaphor traveled beyond the confines of Mount Lebanon, and mental hospitals are now called Aṣfūriyyeh in Palestine, Syria, and Jordan. The Lebanese singer Sabah, who passed away a few years ago, made a popular song in which her lover takes her to Aṣfūriyyeh, presumably because she's madly in love with him. Aṣfūriyyeh has also come to symbolize both the insanity and political folly of a nation, immortalized in the influential play Film Ameriki Tawil, in which the Lebanese artist and playwright Ziad Rahbani criticizes the sectarian nature of politics in Lebanon in the context of the civil war, specifically the years of 1978 to 1980. The setting of the play is a mental hospital, which is widely and popularly assumed and presumed to be Aṣfūriyyeh, though Rahbani never mentions it explicitly, which becomes the reflection of a torn society at war primarily with itself. Unlike more celebrated spaces of memory, however, which are often landmarks that reflect pride in a nation and its accomplishment, Aṣfūriyyeh is in many ways also a non-space whose inhabitants are anonymous, anonymized, or silent. Today, remembered with both dread and fascination, Aṣfūriyyeh is a space at the margins of a city and history, not worthy to be part of a history that glorifies national achievements, which the memory spaces are supposed to represent. And unlike other glorious spaces of memory, this liminal space deals with the forgotten and downtrodden, the dead which cannot be buried, as the medical missionary Cornelius van Dyck referred to the poor insane more than a century ago when he opened the hospital. A non-space deals with suffering, pain, and disease, as well as shattered dreams and painful lives. But can the dreary remains of war be so easily forgotten? Are they so easily fungible? And what shall we make of such prosaic sights in a dystopian age but can the dreary remains of war be so easily forgotten? Are they so easily fungible? And what shall we make of such prosaic sights in a dystopian age that is past both truth and memory? Does it even make sense to speak of a fourth duty, to remember these prosaic and derelict sites, these non-spaces that are anticlimactic and at the margins of history? I'm just going to end with this and kind of think about this idea of having spent the better part of my life thinking a lot about spaces, people, and events that fall at the margin of history as a way to maybe write through with and for them a different kind of history. And I think this book perfectly encapsulates a lot of these ideas and ideals. And it's by pure chance that there's a kind of personal twist to all of this, which is, so I was born in 1983, a year after Aṣfūriyyeh shuts down. And so in a way, this place only exists technically in my past. But somehow, and of late, it has taken over my thinking and possibly my way of working.